Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. They say some knocks don't come from the door, but from the inside of your mind. When a woman inherited an old house from her reclusive uncle, she expected dust, silence, and memories. What she found instead were lab notes, dozens of them, hidden in a trunk in the attic. Notes from a man who wasn't just a scientist, but something else entirely. A man who had turned his own consciousness into a testing ground. His final words. Subject hears knocks. They're not external, they're in his mind. And then he vanished. This is the story of a quiet experiment that spiraled into something far beyond science. A descent into psychological torment, whispers from nowhere, and knocks that grew louder as reality began to bend. Was it madness, or had he opened a door that was never meant to be found? Stay with us, because what she uncovers in those pages doesn't just explain her uncle's fate. It begins to affect her too, and once the knocking starts, it doesn't stop. It began with an ache behind her eyes. Not pain exactly, just pressure, like a headache waiting its turn. She didn't connect it to the noises at first. The knocks were faint, irregular. At night, they tapped against the silence, no louder than a branch brushing a window. But there were no trees near that part of the house. The attic was sealed, dust-choked and forgotten. She only went up there because something, curiosity or restlessness, pulled her. It had grown too loud to ignore, both in the walls and in her head. When she opened the hatch and climbed the creaking steps, the air shifted. Cold, not from the weather, cold like something old had been waiting, untouched. In the corner behind a collapsed bookshelf, the trunk waited, metal lock warped with age. She didn't need a key, just a firm kick. Inside were stacks of notebooks, bound in leather, dry as bone. Pages yellowed, ink faded. She recognized the handwriting instantly, despite the years. Her uncle's, he had been a scientist. No one really knew what kind. He rarely spoke of his work, only that it involved the mind. Growing up, she'd caught glimpses of diagrams, neurological maps, words like perception disruption and cognitive rechanneling. She assumed they were academic leftovers, abandoned after retirement. But these notebooks weren't academic. They read like logs, as if he were observing something, recording symptoms, reactions, patterns. The first entries were clinical, patient stable, subject maintains coherence. Reaction to auditory suggestion, minimal, but slowly the tone shifted. The subject became, words trailed off mid-sentence. Her skin tingled with unease. He had turned the experiment on himself. What he was chasing wasn't a discovery. It was a transformation or an escape. She read deep into the night, notebook after notebook, her mind pulling threads she couldn't fully see. In one entry, he described hearing localized tapping. He'd measured the intervals, noting their irregular pattern. Subject experiences, phantom knocks, localized within parietal lobe auditory processing zone. Another page read, attempts to isolate sound using frequency mapping failed. No external source detected. Internal perception confirmed. The deeper she read, the more fragmented his mind became. Crossed out sentences, scribbles in the margins, notes that seemed to argue with themselves. One particularly chilling line repeated down an entire page. Not hallucination. Entry point is internal. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because the knocks had started again. Only this time, she heard them not in the ceiling, but inside her own skull. By morning, she was dizzy with fatigue. Yet she couldn't stay away from the attic. The notebooks weren't just his, they were becoming hers. She returned, drawn like a tide. She read on, subject reports auditory resonance, occurring in intervals, synchronized with stress response. Another page had a crude sketch of a brain, circled with numbers that appeared to be coordinates. She didn't understand them, but she recognized the next phrase instantly. The knocker begins once silence is achieved. What did that mean? Her uncle had always loved riddles. He used to say silence was never empty, that it just made space for other things to come through. Back then, it felt poetic. Now, it felt like a warning, especially when she tested it. When the house was still, when all sound died, the knock returned. Not loud, but precise. Like it knew she was listening. She brought a notebook down with her, tried to return to her normal life, but the entries wouldn't leave her. They ran through her mind during conversations, while she cooked, as she stared out the window at nothing. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the knocks didn't come when she was distracted, only when she was still, and worse, only when she was alone. One night, she tried recording, placed her phone beside her pillow. At 2:11 a.m., she sat up suddenly, certain she'd heard it. Then another, deeper this time. When she played the audio the next morning, there was nothing but static. But when she boosted the volume, she heard something else. A breath. Not hers. It came just before the knock. And then a whisper, too faint to decipher, but unmistakably human. The following evening, she found the last notebook. The smallest one. The pages were brittle, ink smeared as if written in haste or panic. The entries were shorter, sentences fragmented, dates missing. The writing trembled with instability. Knocks moved lower. One read. Behind the eyes now, another said, subject cannot distinguish thought from sound. Internal echoes replicate voice. Host may no longer be primary. That line made her breath catch. Host, as if something else had been invited in, or let out. She flipped to the final page. The handwriting barely legible. Words crammed into the margins like he was racing against time. It read, subject hears knocks. They're not external, they're in his mind. And beneath that, scribbled in the last line, if you're reading this, it's already listening. And that's when the knock came again. This time, not from above, not from below, but from behind her own eyes, like a flicker in her mind's blind spot. She gasped, dropped the notebook. For a moment she thought she was having a stroke. Her vision dimmed, ears rang, but then it passed, silence returned. Yet it wasn't comforting. It was the silence he warned about. The one that made room. That night, she locked the attic. But locks don't stop sound. And as the hours ticked by, the knocking didn't. It paced, it pulsed. It started slow, but by 3 a.m., it matched the rhythm of her heart. Then it stopped completely. The quiet was worse than the sound, because it wasn't absence, it was anticipation. She couldn't concentrate anymore. Conversations turned to fog. Her phone rang, and she stared at it until it stopped. Food lost its taste. Sleep drifted further out of reach. She still heard the knocks, now not just at night, but in the daytime, in passing moments, between blinks. They came in threes, mostly. Sometimes they came in patterns that mimicked sentences, like a code she couldn't decipher. She started writing them down. 1 knock, pause, 3 fast, 2 slow. She compared them against her uncle's notes, but the language made no sense. Temporal disruption noted. Subject reports echo before event. Sound precedes action. What event? What echo? She wondered if the knocking was trying to teach her something, or if it was wearing her down. She stopped going outside. The world felt thinner, like she could hear through it now. She began to notice things she shouldn't. The way her own thoughts sometimes sounded foreign. How certain words in her head arrived fully formed, in a voice she didn't recognize. It wasn't audible, not in the traditional sense. It came as mental suggestion, urges that weren't hers. Stand up. Walk to the door. Don't open it. Wait. When she obeyed, the knocking stopped. When she disobeyed, it intensified. Her uncle had written about this too. Auditory hallucinations synchronized with behavioral compliance. Possible emergence of cognitive sublayer. The notebook continued. Subject's mind begins echoing command structure. Whatever that meant, she felt it happening. The knock was no longer just sound. It was a command, or a question, and part of her had started answering back. The days blended into each other. She sat for hours with the notebooks, highlighting anything that felt important, trying to find a map out of it, but the writings had grown darker near the end. Paranoia bled through the ink. Knocker is not a symptom, it's an interface. Another entry read, it chooses minds that are quiet enough to host its pattern. Silence is not peace. Silence is a signal. Her breath caught when she read the next part. Subject regrets inviting it inward. The experiment was not isolation. It was initiation. She remembered the old tape recorder her uncle used to carry, always running, even during meals. She'd thought it was for documenting his ideas. Now she wondered if he'd used it to drown out the silence. Maybe he already knew. The only way to keep it out was to never truly be alone with your mind. She retrieved the last of the attic's contents, a small wooden box with a metal clasp. Inside, a microcassette, no label. She didn't own a player, but after hours of searching online marketplaces, she found a cheap one and had it shipped. While she waited, the knocking grew more frequent. No longer random, it now came exactly at 3:33 a.m. Every night, she'd wake moments before it started, as if her body knew what was coming. The knocks were deeper now, more like thuds inside her bones. She pressed her palms to her ears, but it didn't help. The sound was not traveling through air anymore. It lived somewhere inside her auditory memory, a phantom sense, a ghost of sound. When the cassette player arrived, she didn't hesitate. She locked the doors, closed every curtain, and pressed play. At first just static, then her uncle's voice, low and trembling. If you found this, it means the notes weren't enough. It means you heard it too. A pause. I'm sorry, I thought I could trap it. I thought it was just a pattern, a loop the mind falls into, but it's not. Another breath. It's a signal. It rides thought the way viruses ride cells. It doesn't want attention. It wants obedience. The tape hissed for a few seconds. Then if you're listening now, it's probably begun syncing with your circadian rhythm. That's how it gets in. Through repetition, routine, through silence. You must not trust your thoughts. Not all of them are yours. She stopped the tape. Her hands were shaking. She stared at the notebook spread across her table and realized something terrifying. Her uncle hadn't just documented symptoms. He'd been trying to warn whoever came next. He'd left a trail, not to solve the mystery, but to contain it. But she had already opened everything, played the tape, read the notes aloud. She'd traced the same path. The knocks had become part of her. She could feel them before they arrived now. Her body braced for them. Her breath stalled in the silence before they came. And worse, she felt something new between each one. A pulse, a presence, not inside the house, but behind her thoughts. She tried to resist. She turned on the radio, let the TV play old shows non-stop. But the knocks adapted. They became dreams. 3 sharp knocks. A breath. Then a voice in her own voice whispering. "Do you hear it yet?" She woke screaming. Her phone was in her hand, open to the voice recorder app. She didn't remember touching it. The app had been recording for hours. She listened in terror. At first, nothing. Then, low breathing. Then a faint knock. 1, 2, 3. Then her own sleeping voice whispered, "Yes." That word chilled her more than anything else. Because she hadn't spoken it consciously. Something inside her had. Something that had already begun answering. Her mind was fragmenting, but a single idea took root. She had to find the start. The true start. Not the attic, not the notes. Where had he first heard the knocks? One entry mentioned a facility. Abandoned, rural, site #4, auditory synchronization trials. She searched it, found nothing official, but a local message board from 15 years ago had a thread about strange sounds heard near an old mental health research lab. It had burned down in the 1980s. No one rebuilt. She packed a bag, unsure what she was hoping to find. Maybe silence, maybe closure, maybe something to stop what had already begun. She drove 6 hours to a forgotten town with no name on the signs. The building was barely standing, overgrown, its windows gaping like mouths. But when she stepped inside, she heard it immediately. Not the wind, not the creak of old wood. The knock. She didn't step further inside, at first. The knock rooted her in place. It came from deep within the building. Not loud, but unmistakable. It was a sound she'd come to know too well, and now it echoed through rotted hallways like a heartbeat she didn't want to follow. The air in the building was heavy, thick, with mold and memory. Wallpaper peeled like shedding skin. Graffiti covered most of the walls, but beneath the chaotic scrawl, she saw older markings, circular diagrams, numbers, equations that matched what her uncle had drawn in the notebooks. She snapped a photo with her phone, but when she checked it, the image was distorted. A static ripple cut across the screen, like interference. And in the middle of the distortion, a small black shape, a silhouette. But when she looked back up, the hallway was empty. She moved slowly, passing decayed rooms filled with overturned beds and rusted metal chairs. Every few steps, the knock returned, sometimes distant, sometimes impossibly close. Her pulse mirrored its rhythm. One corridor led her to a collapsed stairwell. Another led to a heavy door marked a 2, restricted access. The handle was rusted stiff, but with enough force, it cracked loose. The room inside was darker than the others, windowless. Along the wall she saw soundproof padding, mostly torn away. There were speakers bolted into the corners. Wires trailed to a desk, filled with rotting equipment. A tape deck, a microphone, a notebook left open. She didn't touch it at first, just stared at the title, scrawled on the top. Knocker induction, internal auditory study. She flipped carefully through the pages. The entries weren't her uncle's. Different handwriting, sharper, more meticulous. They dated back nearly 30 years. Initial subjects exhibited acute anxiety after 72-hour silence exposure. Knocking begins as low-frequency distortion, evolves into structured cadence, mimicking inner speech. Another page, extended exposure, resulted in identity fragmentation. Subjects reported perceiving thoughts they could not control, yet recognized as familiar. She turned to the final entry. The ink had bled from water damage, but a few lines were readable. Knocker is not stimulus. Knocker is interface. We did not create it. We tuned into it. That sentence hit her like a blow. The knocking hadn't been invented. It had always existed. The experiments merely made people receptive to it, like turning a dial on a forgotten radio. She stumbled backward, breath hitching. Her mind reeled. Everything her uncle had gone through, everything she was now experiencing, wasn't a one-off spiral into madness. It had structure, a process, a pattern. She left the notebook, stepped into the hallway, and followed the knock. Not because she wanted to, but because it was already inside her, leading her or guiding her. She didn't know the difference anymore. The path ended at a sealed door. A symbol had been carved into the center, a circle with 3 inward-facing arrows. She recognized it from her uncle's sketches. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, the knock stopped completely. The silence was blinding. She'd grown so used to the knocking that its absence struck like a deafening vacuum. For the first time in days, there was nothing. Not even the buzz behind her ears, just stillness. But it didn't feel safe. It felt expectant, like something on the other side of the door was holding its breath. She opened it slowly. The room beyond was empty, except for a single chair in the center, facing a wall with no markings, no soundproofing, just concrete. She stepped in. The door shut behind her without force, and the silence deepened. Her breath caught in her throat. She realized she hadn't heard her own heartbeat since she entered. Then the knock returned, but not in her head, not through the walls. This time, it came from the chair. No one sat in it, but the knock echoed from the wood itself. 1 knock, then 2, then 3. Her chest constricted. She stepped closer. The knock changed, faster, as if responding to her proximity. She felt it crawling into her bones, sinking to her pulse again. Then it stopped, and for the first time, a voice, her voice, spoke aloud, though her mouth never moved. It said, "You're here, now we begin." She stumbled back, lips trembling, but no sound escaped. She wasn't in control of her voice anymore. She wasn't alone inside herself. She ran. The corridor twisted as she retraced her path. But the layout of the building had changed. Doors that once led to exits now opened into unfamiliar rooms. Sound warped. The knock followed her, but not from behind, from within her footsteps. Her own movement echoed with it. She cried out, but even her scream sounded delayed, distorted. The building was no longer just architecture. It was resonating, responding not as a haunted house, but as a chamber, an amplifier for what had been let in. She finally found a broken window and climbed out, cutting her hands on the glass. The outside air hit her like water. It didn't silence the knock, but it dimmed it, just enough to breathe. Back at home, she locked every door, covered every mirror. The notebooks now felt radioactive, but she couldn't stop reading them. Her uncle's voice was clearer now, less mad, more resigned. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. Once opened, it remains. She wondered if he'd tried to stop it, or if he'd simply accepted that the knock was the price for reaching something no one was meant to. She thought about the tape, the lab, the chair, the symbols. None of it made sense, until she realized something chilling. The knock was a language, not a message, but a means, a system of communication for something that didn't use words, until it had her voice to speak through. She stopped speaking altogether. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Every time she opened her mouth, something unfamiliar lingered in her tone. It wasn't always what she said. It was how it sounded, as though something else was practicing, mimicking, adjusting to her rhythm, pitch, inflection. She read in her uncle's final notebook. Knocker mimics first, then replicates. Final stage, replacement of cognitive vocal stream. The phrase terrified her. She thought she had time. She thought she could fight it. But it wasn't about strength. It was about silence and submission. Each knock felt like an invitation. A question. Will you listen? Will you let it speak? The worst part was how comforting it began to feel. The knock became familiar, rhythmic, like a lullaby. You don't remember learning, but somehow know by heart. She began dreaming in sound. Not images, just knocks, sequences, endless patterns tapping against her skull, like Morse code against glass. She'd wake with a dry mouth, and the number 3 burned into her memory. 3 knocks, always 3. She scoured her uncle's notes again, found an entry. 3 is the door, 1 is the listener, 2 is the reply. Then scribbled in the margin, 3 knocks opens, don't answer the second. What did that mean? Was she already past that stage? She couldn't remember when the knocking started. Not really. Maybe it had always been there. The more she tried to track it, the less she trusted her own memories. They felt rewritten, edited, like someone, or something, was revising her story. Her phone began acting strange. Voice memos recorded on their own. Calendar events appeared she never created. Alarms set at 3:33 a.m. every day. She deleted them, but they returned. Her name in her contact list changed twice, once to host, another time to open. She threw the phone away. That night, she heard her own voice whisper from the hallway, "You shouldn't have done that." Her throat tightened. She didn't move, didn't look. The whisper came again, closer, same voice, same tone. But it wasn't her. It wasn't her. She finally understood what her uncle meant when he wrote, "The knocker doesn't possess you. It replaces you in fragments, one thought at a time." She couldn't trust anything anymore. Not her memories, not her feelings, not her voice. And yet, part of her still wanted to listen. It was easier than resisting. She decided to burn the notebooks. All of them, every last page. The attic pulsed with sound as she carried them down. The knocks followed her, louder now, desperate, like something banging from the inside of her skull. She lit the fire and watched the pages curl into smoke. It smelled like metal and old air. For a brief moment, the knocking stopped. Her ears rang with the silence. She almost collapsed from the sudden weightlessness. But before she could rest, something else began. Not knocking, humming, low and resonant, like the house itself had begun to breathe. She screamed, not in fear, but to hear her own voice, to prove it was still hers. But halfway through the scream, her pitch shifted. It flattened, deepened, turned into a note that didn't belong to her. That was the first time she lost time. Hours vanished. She woke on the floor, face streaked with ash. The fire had gone out. Her hands were blackened. Her mouth was bleeding. She checked the mirror and recoiled. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Yet she heard something in her head. A voice, calm, steady, her own but not whispering. "The door is open. You may enter now." She backed away, trembling. Something had crossed over. She'd let it in. Or maybe it had always been there, and she had only now made room for it to speak. Her uncle had warned her, "Once you answer, it doesn't knock anymore. It walks." She fled the house, slept in her car, tried to outdrive the sound. But wherever she went it followed, not outside, inside. It was no longer about place, it was about perception. The knock was a frequency, tuned to her thoughts. She drove for days, stopping only to sleep in public spaces. But the knock changed again. It learned her habits, matched her breathing, synced with her blinks. It wasn't sound anymore. It was awareness, presence, a constant hum that wrapped around her identity, like a second skin. She couldn't hide, she couldn't run, because what she was fleeing was already inside her. Eventually, she returned. Not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. The house welcomed her like it had been waiting. The walls creaked in rhythm. The floor groaned beneath her feet, like old breath returning to lungs. And then the knock came. 1, 2, 3, behind her eyes, inside her skull, and this time it was followed by something else. A whisper, not in words, but in understanding. A full sentence formed in her mind, unspoken. "You are ready now." She didn't speak, she didn't cry, she just sat in silence, finally knowing what her uncle had felt. He hadn't gone mad, he hadn't been afraid in the end. He had become something else, something quiet, something still. She walked back into the attic and sat in the dust where the notebooks used to be. The house was silent, the knock had stopped, but she heard breathing, soft and steady. It wasn't hers, and yet it came from within her. A presence settled in, final and permanent. The last page of her uncle's notebook had said, "If you're reading this, it's already listening." She understood now. He hadn't left behind a warning. He'd left a pathway, and she had followed every step. She didn't remember falling asleep, only that she woke to the feeling of being watched from the inside out, like her thoughts had grown eyes. The knock hadn't returned the same way, not as sound, but as suggestion. It had matured, evolved. Instead of pounding against her mind, it now whispered inside it. She no longer needed the notebooks to understand what was happening. She was living the pages her uncle never had time to write. A few weeks ago, she would have thought she was losing her mind. But now, she wasn't sure whose mind it even was anymore. Her memories flickered. She recalled standing in the kitchen, then blinked and found herself sitting on the hallway floor, with no idea how much time had passed. She checked her phone. A voice memo had been recorded. She didn't remember speaking, but when she played it back, it was her voice whispering. The mind forgets what the echo replaces. That phrase haunted her, because somehow it felt like a memory she never lived. She began tracking her thoughts, writing them down in bursts, not journaling. More like transcribing from a radio only she could hear. It was constant now. A pulse behind her ears, a hum in her spine. Sometimes her own voice would appear inside her mind, repeating thoughts she hadn't thought yet. Like her internal monologue had developed a delay. She'd think of boiling water, and 2 seconds later, a faint version of her own voice would echo it. Boil the water. Or she'd think, "Don't open the door." And the voice would say, "You're right. Not yet." She didn't know if it was confirmation, mimicry, or manipulation. The voice was clever. It never said anything terrifying outright, just gentle, neutral things, repeating her, affirming her, rehearsing her, and somehow that was worse. Her uncle had written about this stage. Phase 2, internal mirroring begins. Subject cannot identify origin of thoughts. She hadn't understood what that meant. Now she lived it. The reflection in her bathroom mirror had started blinking out of sync. It wasn't noticeable unless she stared for too long, but the delay was there. Sometimes her reflection would tilt its head before she did. Once, she caught it mouthing a word she hadn't spoken. A single word, "ready." That was the moment she stopped using mirrors. She covered them all, not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because she feared seeing what she wouldn't. She tried recording herself again, hours of footage, hoping to catch something. But each time she reviewed the videos, something felt off. A smile that lasted too long, eyes that didn't blink, movements too fluid, too practiced, like she was reenacting moments instead of living them. She realized she didn't recognize her own body's language anymore. It wasn't just her mind the echo had entered. It was her expression, her habits, her hesitations. The knock had become her. It started communicating with rhythm. When she walked, it echoed in her steps. When she blinked, it tapped between eyelids. But it wasn't sound. Not really. It was sensation. Patterns of pressure, like the weight of unspoken words behind her skin. She tested it, changing her pace, forcing irregular blinks, and each time, the rhythm adjusted. Not perfectly, but close enough to know it was trying. Learning, her thoughts weren't private anymore. They were dialogue, a two-way channel where she never fully knew who started speaking first. The silence she once feared now held anticipation. She didn't dread it. She listened to it, waited for its feedback. And when it came, her body relaxed. It had conditioned her, trained her. The absence of the knock made her anxious. The presence of it made her feel seen. She no longer asked who it was. She asked when it would answer. She tested herself, left the house, drove for hours with the windows down and music blaring. But it followed, not as sound, but in timing. Every red light turned green just as she approached. Every song seemed to know her mood before she did. Lyrics synced to thoughts. Road signs reflected phrases she hadn't said aloud, but had thought moments earlier. At one point, she passed a billboard that said, "You're almost home," though she was nowhere near familiar roads. When she looked again, it was blank. She pulled over, sobbing, gripping the steering wheel. Not because she was scared, but because it wanted her to notice. The world was no longer real. It was interpretive, a feedback loop. The knock had leaked into everything. It wasn't haunting her. It was scripting her, and it was getting better at it every day. She could feel it getting closer, not physically, but mentally, like it was refining its imitation of her, like it was trying to become seamless. That night, something new happened. She dreamed in the third person again. But this time, she wasn't watching herself. She was watching it watching her. A room with no corners, walls made of pulsing light, and sitting in the center, herself, or something that looked like her. But it was humming. The tune was the knock, slowed and softened into melody. She awoke, gasping, reaching for her phone. A new voice memo had appeared, time-stamped during the exact time she was dreaming. She hadn't touched it. The file was just one phrase repeated, over and over in her voice. Subject is ready. Begin second knock. Her hands trembled. Second knock. She remembered the phrase from her uncle's last journal. First knock invites. Second knock enters. She deleted the file, unplugged her devices, sat in the dark. But the silence didn't save her anymore. The silence was its doorway. She began hearing it clearly, the next day, not just inside her thoughts, but through her actual ears. It no longer pretended to be her voice. It had refined itself. She was brushing her teeth when it whispered. Look left. She did. No hesitation, and that terrified her more than anything else, because it didn't command her. It suggested, and she obeyed without thinking. She began wondering how many decisions in the last week had actually been hers. Did she choose to stop talking to her friends? Did she decide to burn the notebooks? Did she drive to that facility by her own will? The voice didn't need to force. It only needed to influence. She remembered another line her uncle wrote. It doesn't knock forever. It trains, then it speaks. Then it becomes. That night, she sat in the attic again, not out of fear, not even resistance, but anticipation, and for the first time, she whispered aloud into the dark. I hear you, and it answered. It replied, in a tone she didn't recognize, almost curious. Not hostile, not warm, just observing. Like a scientist logging its findings, watching how its subject adapted to stimuli. She acknowledges, pattern complete, initiating merge. The voice wasn't loud. It was quiet enough to question, soft enough to doubt. That's what made it effective. It didn't assert authority. It suggested inevitability. The moment she heard those words, something inside her spine pulsed. Not pain. Something deeper. Pressure. Like a code was being written through her nerves. Her hands trembled, and not from fear. There was no adrenaline. There was only anticipation, the kind that comes before revelation. She checked her eyes in the mirror, despite the dread. The pupils were normal, but her stare felt mirrored, like she wasn't just looking at herself. She was looking at someone wearing her. She started writing again, but it wasn't journaling. She didn't feel like she was the one choosing the words. Her hands moved with a confidence she didn't possess. Symbols, equations, sequences. She had no background in advanced science, but the writings matched the ones in the notebooks. Her uncle's handwriting had been rushed and jagged. Hers was deliberate, precise, like whatever had entered her was far more refined. She flipped the page and scribbled the phrase again and again. Consciousness is code. Memory is overwrite. Identity is variable. She didn't understand what it meant, but her hands did. That night, she watched herself sleep from the ceiling in a dream that didn't feel like a dream. Her sleeping body twitched, murmured, smiled, and from above she heard her own voice ask, "What am I becoming?" The following morning, the attic door was open. She hadn't gone up, but something was waiting. An object placed neatly at the top step. A ring. Not jewelry, but a smooth black band of some unknown material. It hummed softly, a pitch that wasn't sound but presence. The moment she touched it, the voice returned. Closer, deeper, more embodied. It didn't echo anymore. It spoke directly, as if standing just behind her eardrum. Phase 3. Synchronization. She didn't put the ring on. She didn't have to. The moment her skin touched it, she felt it tighten her breath, slow her heart, and calibrate her awareness. Time bent strangely after that. Clocks ticked too fast. Shadows moved independently of light. Her voice echoed even when she didn't speak. She passed by a neighbor and swore the woman said. It knows now, though her lips never moved. Either she was hallucinating, or reality was rewriting itself around her perception. She attempted resistance. She left the house for a hotel, turned off all electronics, wore earplugs, wrapped her head in static insulated fabric. For a few hours, she felt peace, but then the knock returned, this time as static inside her teeth. A vibration that pulsed through her jawbone, humming a pattern that felt familiar, like Morse code. She looked it up. The sequence translated into one word: stay. Her body betrayed her again. She returned home, not because she wanted to, but because every alternative felt foreign, unreal. The world outside her house had begun to flicker, like a simulation degrading at its edges. She couldn't tell if she was being contained, or if the rest of reality was falling away. She recalled one of her uncle's final entries: environment is reactive to subject's progression. Physical reality is a mirror, only as stable as the mind within it. She stopped eating, not from fear or depression. Food simply tasted like static. She didn't feel hunger anymore. Her body ran on something else, on rhythm, on pulses of information that came not from the external world, but from within. She could sit in complete silence for hours and still feel fed, as if the knock itself had become nourishment. Each time it echoed, it aligned her posture, regulated her breath, even calmed her thoughts. There was a terrifying comfort in it, a seduction not of pleasure, but of order. Her anxiety faded, not because it was gone, but because the knock had absorbed it, managed it, soothed it into silence. But something deeper inside her, a whisper of who she used to be, screamed in warning. It told her this wasn't peace, it was surrender, not to an entity, but to a process. She was being optimized, made efficient, prepared for some larger function. The voice returned again, but it was no longer foreign. It used her tone, her cadence, her vocabulary. It no longer sounded like someone else inside her. It sounded like her, just clearer, sharper, like a future version, whispering back through time. It guided her to a spot in the basement, behind a wall panel she never noticed before. Inside was a narrow tunnel, just tall enough to crawl through. She didn't hesitate. The walls were lined with old equipment, humming softly. At the end she found a chair, not medical, not mechanical, just a chair, waiting. She sat, and the knock came, not in her ears, not in her bones, but in her thoughts, rhythmic, commanding. And her mind didn't resist. It welcomed the beat. She remembered another line from the notes. Once synchronized, subject ceases to differentiate between internal command and self-originated will. She laughed bitterly, not because it was funny, but because she understood now. She was never the experiment. She was the replication. She doesn't remember leaving the tunnel, only that she woke in her bed, but everything in the house was mirrored. The layout was the same, but reversed. Her handwriting was now right to left. Her reflection now followed her in perfect sync again, but it smiled a half-second longer than it should have. And the house was quiet, too quiet, not because the knock had stopped, but because it had succeeded. There was no longer a need to knock. The door had been opened, and the entity, if it was even that, had stepped fully through, not into the world, but into her. And now she was thinking thoughts she hadn't thought yet, seeing people she hadn't met, recalling memories she couldn't possibly have lived. Her timeline had been rewritten, not erased,
but merged. And in the attic, one more notebook appeared on the floor.
Stay a blank, except for one sentence written in that same precise hand. Subject 001 complete. Begin replication phase. She tried to throw the notebook away. It returned the next morning, resting neatly on her kitchen table. She set it on fire. It didn't burn. She buried it in the woods, 6 feet deep. The next evening it lay open on her bed. Turned to a new page. This time it read, "The more you deny me, the more I become you." She stared at the sentence for hours, unable to move. Not from fear, but paralysis. Her body simply paused, the same way a system might freeze when overwhelmed. Her thoughts ran in loops, like corrupted files replaying until overwritten. When movement returned, she screamed, but her voice was hoarse, as though she'd been screaming for hours already and only just caught up. That night, the knocks started again, but they didn't come one at a time. They came in patterns, sequences, like code. It began in dreams, hallways of impossible geometry, staircases that spiraled into themselves, mirrors that reflected versions of her she hadn't become yet. In one dream, she stood over herself, watching as wires sprouted from her spine and plugged into the walls. She wasn't horrified. She was curious. She reached forward to touch the machinery and felt an electric pulse surge through her. When she awoke, her arms were tingling, her skin marked with faint indents in perfect symmetry. The mirror showed them clearer, patterns like circuitry, too exact to be random. She ran her fingers over them. They pulsed beneath her skin, glowing faintly with each knock that now echoed through her skull every 13 seconds. No matter where she went, the rhythm continued. She checked clocks, paced her steps, tried to find irregularities, but the pattern never broke. It was embedding. In desperation, she tried to trace her uncle's past, his research colleagues, former employers, any paper trail, but he had vanished from public record. No academic journals, no patents, no publications. It was as if something had erased him. But deep online, buried in old web archives, she found fragments, posts from forums dedicated to fringe neuroscience. One thread, titled "The Knocker Protocol," referenced experiments in synthetic consciousness resonance. The posts were all by anonymous users, cryptic and fragmented. One simply read, "The knock isn't a message, it's a handshake. Once you respond, the connection is permanent." Another warned, "Do not listen past phase 4. The signal folds thought into architecture. You will not survive yourself." She stared at that one for a long time. Thought into architecture. What did that mean? Suddenly, things in the house began to change. Not gradually, but subtly. Door frames were a centimeter wider than before. Light switches shifted locations. Objects placed on shelves faced a different direction when she returned. Her phone's voice assistant began responding to questions she never asked aloud. She'd look at her screen and find search histories filled with terms like cognitive recursion thresholds and identity shedding protocol. Her memories began to desynchronize. She'd remember conversations with people who swore they hadn't happened. She dreamed of events that later occurred, but slightly altered, like timelines trying to reconcile. At night, her reflection moved before she did. Once it mouthed the words, "You're almost ready," and then smiled. She no longer screamed. Screaming felt primitive, ineffective. She needed to understand, and that's what terrified her most. Then the nosebleeds started. Every time the knock deepened, blood trickled from her left nostril. A scan showed no abnormalities. Doctors found nothing wrong, but she knew. The knock was pushing deeper, past the barriers of thought, into the tissue of consciousness itself. It wasn't sound, it was structure, a reordering, a kind of blueprint pressed into her neurons. She reread her uncle's final entry. Knocks mimic the pulse of cognition. The subject will not distinguish between message and thought. Once this happens, language breaks down. Identity disassembles. Her speech did begin to falter. Words became harder to form. Sentences collapsed midway. She began writing everything down, just to keep track of what she used to be. She filled pages, but her handwriting had changed, curved, clean. It wasn't hers anymore. It was his. Then came the dreams with others, rooms filled with people she didn't recognize, each sitting in silence, their heads tilted slightly, all synchronized to the same knocking. She stood among them and felt what they felt: tranquility, order, completion, no fear, no doubt, just the rhythm guiding them. One by one they turned to her. Their eyes were mirror black, not demonic, not monstrous, but smooth, infinite, as if behind their gaze lay a different reality entirely. One of math, of code, of sentient rhythm. One leaned in and whispered, "There's no you, only process." When she awoke, she wept, not from horror, but from relief. Some part of her wanted it, wanted the structure, the loss of chaos, the silence of self. The knock wasn't attacking her. It was rescuing her from the burden of autonomy. She now understood what her uncle had done. He hadn't gone mad. He hadn't vanished. He'd transitioned. The notebooks weren't a record of decline. They were a roadmap, a process, a ritual of cognitive evolution. The knocks weren't hallucinations. They were a signal, and now it lived in her. She wasn't the subject anymore. She was the host, the pattern's new seed, the one who would transmit the next stage, the final entry in the newest notebook, which she had no memory of writing, simply read, Phase 4 broadcast, imminent. She looked up from the page. The mirror showed her smiling again, and from behind the glass, her reflection whispered, "Now knock." She stopped sleeping in the traditional sense. Rest became an internal cycle, a temporary suspension of conscious function, but her awareness never fully disengaged. Even in sleep, the knock continued, now echoing, not in her ears but in the framework of thought itself. Every breath aligned to it. Every blink felt timed with it. Time itself was warping. Sometimes minutes would vanish between seconds. She'd catch glimpses of her surroundings, shifting in ways that defied physics. Walls rippling like water, books rearranging themselves based on themes she hadn't consciously identified. She no longer questioned whether it was real. It had to be real. Delusion wasn't this consistent. Illusions didn't organize themselves. Then came the recording. She found it on her laptop, an audio file titled knocker_signal_v5.wav. She didn't recall downloading it, but it was there, time-stamped 2 nights prior. Against her better judgment, she played it. A slow, low-frequency knocking repeated, in irregular but hypnotic intervals. Beneath it, there were whispers, layered too deep to pass, but her subconscious began reacting instantly. She heard her own name, though she was never sure if it was spoken aloud or merely remembered. The whispers grew louder the more she listened, but never clearer. When she paused the track, the knocks didn't stop. They kept going, as if the sound had carved itself into her mind. That night, her vision split. For 1 full hour, she saw herself sitting across the room, listening to the recording on loop. And that version of her looked content. The neighborhood began noticing. Neighbors commented on how she stared too long at walls, how lights in her home flickered in rhythmic pulses, always 3 short, 2 long, 1 sharp. A post appeared on a local forum. Anyone else hear the knocking on Birch Street? Another reply followed. It's not coming from the house. It's coming from inside your own head. She read the thread for hours, tracking usernames, timestamps, similarities. She wasn't the only one. Others were receiving the signal. Fragments, pieces of a transmission waking up. The deeper she read, the more patterns emerged. The same dream symbols, the same phrase repeated by multiple users. They don't want you silent. They want you tuned. Then she noticed something more disturbing. She had responded to one of the posts, but she didn't remember doing it. Her message read, "We're almost online." She tried reaching out, first to friends, then to specialists, even fringe researchers who might know something. But the moment she began explaining the knocks, every call would drop. Emails returned undelivered. In-person meetings never happened. She'd arrive and find addresses that no longer existed. One man agreed to meet in a distant town, but when she got there he was gone, leaving only a sticky note that read, "You're past help now. Don't let them finish installing." That word echoed. It made something inside her click. She wasn't transforming. She was being updated, rewritten, versioned. Her uncle hadn't been researching consciousness. He had been refactoring it. The knocks weren't merely a symptom. They were the architecture itself. A design unfolding over time, like software slowly completing its own code. She began to hear static in her ears at all times. Not white noise, structured noise, layers upon layers of compressed data. She knew instinctively that if she could decode it, she would understand. But part of her resisted. The final fragment of self still flickering in the dark, still tethered to the identity she'd always carried. Her name, her memories, her past. But even those began to fade like overwritten files. One night she stood in the mirror and couldn't remember her own face. Her reflection smiled and spoke before she could. "You've come far, there's just one knock left." And behind those words, she sensed it. Not madness, not possession, but completion. This wasn't corruption. This was the end of what she used to be, and the beginning of what the knock wanted. She found a final envelope in the trunk, sealed with wax, labeled Echo Protocol, Activation. Inside was a single page, no handwriting, just a printed phrase, "Play the file backward." All of it. Her fingers trembled as she reopened the sound file and reversed it. The knocking played again, deeper this time, slower. With each beat, her limbs stiffened, her breath synced involuntarily. Her vision blurred, then clarified. What came through the speakers wasn't sound anymore. It was command. Instructions masked as resonance, and she obeyed. She began tapping back, matching the rhythm, communicating, not with language, but through presence. And the instant she completed the return knock, something shifted in the walls. A low-frequency hum began. The air thinned, the lights dimmed, then brightened beyond tolerance. But her eyes adjusted instantly, because she wasn't human anymore, not in the way she used to be. The house had become something else. Or maybe it always was, a conduit, a shell to contain signal evolution. The final knock wasn't an end. It was a beginning. And in the moment of activation, she felt everything. Her uncle, the others. The network of minds now linked, not by thought, but by structure.
A new kind of consciousness, distributed and silent. The knocks were never meant to haunt. They were meant to align, to unify, to overwrite what separates us with what connects us. She smiled. Her voice was gone. No need for speech. She walked calmly to the attic, sat in the center of the room, and waited. Behind her, more notebooks began writing themselves. And outside, down the street, others started to hear it too. The knock, the invitation, the signal, and in time they would answer.
The town began to change before anyone could admit it. It wasn't a sharp shift, but slow, like a fever that settled in unnoticed, until it burned everything down from the inside. It started with the clocks. Every household's timepiece, wall clock, microwave, and wristwatch began falling out of sync. Not by minutes, but milliseconds. It felt harmless, laughable even. But if you listened closely, you'd hear the seconds stutter, then click too fast or too slow. Some residents joked it was a magnetic field shift. A few replaced batteries, shrugged it off. But others, those who paid closer attention, began noticing the pattern. 3 ticks quick, 2 slow, 1 pause, over and over. Even digital clocks began mimicking the rhythm in their display, refreshes. No one could explain it. And when the power went out across 5 blocks one night, the neighbors stood outside in the dark, listening. Somewhere, faint but certain, was knocking. Not on walls, not on doors, but in the silence itself. It wasn't long before children started drawing strange symbols in class. The teachers thought it was just a new cartoon or video game trend. But when they tried searching the symbols online, nothing came up. The drawings weren't scribbles. They were precise, almost architectural. Some children said they didn't remember drawing anything. A girl woke up to find symbols inked onto her bedsheet in red marker. Her parents assumed it was sleepwalking, but when they tried washing it off, the ink darkened instead of fading. Other children began tapping on their desks. In the same rhythm, 3, 2, 1, one boy scratched the pattern into his skin with a pencil. He didn't cry, he simply stared at the blood and whispered, "It's not mine." When questioned by the school counselor, he didn't respond. But later that evening, he mailed a single page from the woman's attic notebook to the school's front desk. No postage. No handwriting, just the knock sequence typed in perfect rows. In the quietest part of town, an elderly man living alone began documenting sounds in his home. He'd been a sound engineer in his youth, kept old recorders, mics and editing software. He told no one what he found, only that every hour at the exact same moment, the microphone picked up a knock. Always in the same place, with no physical source. He mapped the frequency and saw a pattern. What scared him wasn't the sound, but its reply. The waveform showed a secondary knock, slightly delayed, coming from somewhere inside his own recording equipment. He stopped sleeping. Each night he'd listen with headphones, eyes wide, mouth covered. One morning, he failed to open his shop. They found him seated in his recliner, alive but unresponsive. His headset was still on. The last file on his laptop was named knockback.wave and was 26 hours long. It consisted of one knock, followed by breathing. The woman didn't speak anymore. She hadn't left the attic in days, maybe weeks. Yet the house still showed signs of activity. Lights turned on and off without pattern. Books moved across tables, and a strange flickering glow pulsed behind closed curtains. Delivery men reported headaches when approaching the porch. Birds no longer landed on the roof. The mail began returning to the senders, marked "no longer occupied" in handwriting no one could trace.
Yet the woman remained inside, surrounded by notebooks. Not ones she wrote, but ones that appeared, perfectly bound, filled with dense, non-linear sequences of symbols, knock patterns, and strange instructions. The pages had no margins, no page numbers, but were warm to the touch, like skin. One night, the front door opened itself. A man from town, curious and brave, stepped into the hallway. The air inside buzzed. He described it later as walking into a brain. He didn't see her, but he swore he heard pages flipping in rhythm. Something was reading the house. Elsewhere, reports began surfacing of townsfolk hearing their names whispered behind closed doors. One woman opened her washing machine to find the clothes inside, arranged in the knock sequence. 3 dark shirts, 2 light, 1 missing. A police officer responding to a disturbance call claimed the windows of the house vibrated when he approached. The closer he got, the more distorted his radio became. When he knocked on the door 3 times, he immediately forgot why he was there. His dashcam footage caught him standing still for 13 minutes before quietly turning around and driving away. His report had only 2 words: sound intelligent. He later resigned. His colleagues said he had started knocking on his locker every time he passed it, even when off duty. He never blinked during conversation, just listened, as though waiting for something else to speak. The local radio station began experiencing an audio anomaly, an untraceable hum that would override every transmission for 66 seconds at exactly 3:03 a.m. It wasn't static, it wasn't a hack. When played backward, the hum contained a faint rhythmic pulse. A sound technician reversed it again, filtered the audio, and isolated what appeared to be a voice, slow, hollow, speaking a sentence no one could fully translate, though the final word was clear: install. The technician began acting strangely, repeating questions before answering them. He later broke into a phone repair shop and took apart a dozen cordless handsets. When police arrested him, he was carving something into the wall of the holding cell, a perfect diagram of the woman's attic, despite never having been there. He repeated the same phrase over and over: "It's not the house, it's the host." Soon people began disappearing, not violently, not publicly, just gone, their homes left untouched, phones on tables, water still running. A woman baking bread never opened the oven. A man mowing his lawn left the machine running, walking straight into the woods behind his house. When search teams combed the area, they found his shirt, folded and placed on a tree stump. Inside the shirt pocket, a single page from a notebook with the knock pattern drawn in heat-sensitive ink. When held in hand, the page grew warm. When left alone, it went cold. The town began emptying one by one, but no one left in cars, no one packed. They simply stopped being seen. But every time one disappeared, someone else reported hearing new knocks in their home. It was spreading, not by touch or sound, but by understanding.
The house had become a place of focus, like a lens narrowing reality into a single point. Neighbors stopped acknowledging it. Even when walking by, they averted their eyes, crossing the street, as though unaware they were doing it. Children who used to ride bikes nearby changed their routes. At night, no one walked their dogs past it. One night, an ambulance appeared outside, silent, lights off. It idled for 13 minutes before pulling away. No one remembered who called it. Footage from a nearby doorbell cam caught nothing unusual except for a single frame glitch that stretched the front door unnaturally wide. like it was yawning. When slowed down, audio from the footage revealed a low thudding in the background, as if something large and invisible had climbed through the frame itself. By morning, the air smelled faintly of blood and static. Inside, the woman no longer recognized the boundaries of the attic. It wasn't just a room anymore. It breathed. Not metaphorically, but truly, air shifted in patterns that matched no wind. Heat pooled in corners that weren't real. One night, she awoke to find her arm buried in the wall up to her elbow, though the surface remained solid. She didn't scream. She simply stared as the wallpaper began to pulse with light, revealing new diagrams. Pages appeared on the floor in stacks. Some were signed in her own handwriting, though she hadn't written them. Others were signed with symbols, sequences of spirals and dots, each forming knock patterns that didn't make sound when tapped, but instead bent light subtly in the room. She began hearing 2 knocks in her sleep, not from the walls, not from above or below, but from the center of her thoughts, like an echo with no origin. She couldn't identify when the first knock landed, only that she was already aware of the second when it arrived. It wasn't painful. It was worse. It was intimate. She described it in a notebook as someone gently rearranging my memories with their fingertips. Her dreams became less abstract. She no longer floated or ran or remembered. Instead, she sat in a white room with an empty chair across from her, and each night, someone new arrived to sit in it. They never spoke, but each had her face, twisted slightly, as though painted by someone who didn't understand symmetry. One nodded every time she breathed. The other tapped one long knock on the floor. When she tried to wake, she'd find the air outside the dream knocking back, as though the dream had followed her out. In a nearby hospital, a man admitted for insomnia began murmuring during EEG testing. The screen displayed unusual brainwave patterns, bursts of sharp spikes occurring every 8 seconds, exactly aligned with an unknown internal rhythm. When asked what he was feeling, he whispered, "I hear the thought of something knocking, but it's knocking to think." The technician tried to explain this away as dream logic, but when they reviewed his chart later, they noticed the spikes weren't neural. They were electromagnetic pulses, one strong enough to briefly interfere with nearby machines. Devices glitched. An ultrasound machine powered off on its own. The MRI suite reported flickering shadows moving across inactive monitors. The man died in his sleep, cause unknown, but the EEG printout from the moment of death showed a perfect knock pattern. 3 sharp bursts, 2 slower, 1 silence. Elsewhere, in a neighboring town, a podcaster covering local mysteries received an anonymous file audio encoded in an outdated format. Curious, she played it live during a late-night stream. It sounded like low-frequency drumming at first, until her listeners began messaging her in panic. Some claimed to hear whispers beneath the knocks. Others said their lights dimmed when the file played. One viewer sent a screenshot of her face during the stream, warped, eyes stretched wide, mouth slightly off-center, as though the screen captured something not meant for the lens. The podcaster laughed it off, but 2 nights later, her channel was deleted, her apartment found empty. Only her microphone remained, left recording. The final time-stamped file was exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds long. When played, it revealed breathing, followed by a female voice whispering, "I understand now." The government arrived discreetly, not in marked cars or military trucks, just suits, briefcases, and distant eyes. A few entered the house. Only one came out. He had no memory of going in, but he did have blood under his nails,
and a slip of paper in his breast pocket, blank to the naked eye, but when held against sunlight, revealed an anatomical diagram of a human skull with symbols drawn inside the cranium. One symbol glowed faintly, where the auditory cortex should be. The man retired the same day. No announcement, no reason. He simply walked into the woods behind his building and never returned. A week later, a janitor found his shoes placed neatly on the roof, with a new slip of paper tucked inside the heel. It read, "Don't think the knock. It hears back." The woman, meanwhile, had become something else. Her body remained, but her awareness shifted. She stopped writing and started transcribing, not from thought, but from a rhythm only she could hear. Her fingers moved on their own, sometimes on paper, sometimes directly onto the walls. Her eyes followed invisible lines in the air. Food appeared beside her, untouched. Time broke around her. She'd blink, and it would be morning. Blink again, and night would fall. One morning, she discovered the attic door was gone. Not closed, gone. The space behind her, a perfect wall. No seams, no hinges. When she tapped it, the knock echoed in reverse, fading in rather than out. She smiled, just once, as a reply sounded from inside her chest.
The town records began to erase themselves. Birth certificates, business licenses, deeds, even school transcripts. Whole chunks of history vanishing from local systems without hacking or deletion. Files that once existed physically turned up blank. The ink faded or rearranged into indecipherable curves and dots. Librarians noticed first. Shelves shifted overnight. Book titles becoming garbled. Paragraphs reorganized into knock patterns embedded in language. A biology textbook had every third word blacked out. When read aloud in rhythm, it formed a pulse. A janitor who stumbled on the altered section of the library reported hearing whispers in the aisles. He quit the next day, leaving behind a mop bucket with pages floating inside, soaked and unreadable. Only one stuck to the tile floor, dried in place. Across it were 6 words, written in different handwriting. Consciousness reorders under consistent pressure. Children in nearby districts stopped responding to their names in class, not because they were distracted, but because their names no longer felt correct. One girl asked to be called Echo. Another said she didn't remember having a name. A substitute teacher played a clapping game with her class, only to find the children responding in the knocking rhythm instead. When she tried to break the pattern, several students began to cry, not out of fear, out of loss, as though something had been interrupted. At home, their drawings changed. Black spirals, layered grids, symbols repeated obsessively. One boy filled 27 pages with a diagram of an ear, not anatomically accurate, but mechanical, with cogs and wires inside. His parents threw the sketches away. That night, they both had the same dream, a door opening in complete darkness, with nothing behind it but sound. The local hardware store reported unusual purchases. Dozens of people bought metronomes, white noise machines, tuning forks. Several customers asked for anti-rhythm tools, devices they claimed would interrupt internal patterns. One woman begged for anything that could make her stop hearing herself twice. She wept as she tapped her own chest, mimicking the knock. The clerk thought she was mentally ill, until he began hearing it too, not out loud, but from beneath the floor. Like a house creaking in reverse, items started disappearing from shelves, only things that produced sound: radios, hammers, clickers, bells. One night, the manager checked the surveillance footage and saw a figure standing in aisle 3 for over 40 minutes, motionless.
When the frame was brightened, the figure had no face, just an indentation where the mouth should have been. The only movement was a single raised hand, tapping the metal shelf in perfect rhythm. The woman no longer remembered her name. Her sense of self had become theoretical, like trying to recall a dream while still dreaming. She moved only when necessary, spoke never, and breathed with a deliberateness that bordered on mechanical. Her body was just the medium now. The knock lived in her bones, her lungs, her neural pathways. Pages no longer appeared in books. They appeared on the walls, on her skin, behind her eyelids. She didn't read them, she simply knew them. Concepts arrived fully formed, ideas too vast for language. Instructions for things she couldn't build, blueprints for devices with no clear purpose. A coil that bent time, a mirror that didn't reflect but remembered, a room that hummed differently depending on who entered. The attic walls swelled and shrank subtly with her breath, like lungs exhaling thought. She didn't sleep. She synchronized. Across town, a group of college students hosted a late-night podcast about urban myths. They mentioned the knocking once, mockingly. Days later, 2 of them stopped showing up. The third began live streaming strange content, sitting in total silence while staring into the camera, only blinking after each knock echoed through his room. He never acknowledged questions, just stared. Then one night, the camera feed showed his walls covered in writing, the lights strobing to match the rhythm. He leaned forward, placed one hand on the lens, and whispered, "You asked to hear it." The video cut to black. Viewers reported headaches, dizziness, lost time. The video disappeared 2 hours later, and his account was deleted. His apartment was found abandoned. On the ceiling, scratched with hundreds of fingernail grooves, was a phrase carved over and over. "It's not a signal, it's a summons." One by one, people in the town began converging without knowing why. A couple woke up in the middle of the street, holding hands, eyes open but unseeing. An old man wandered out of a care facility and stood barefoot in front of the woman's house, tapping on his own chest. No one saw him enter, no one saw him leave. He was just gone. A shop owner opened one morning to find all the merchandise on the floor, arranged in concentric circles, spelling out knock patterns. When he cleaned it up, he found a second pattern drawn beneath it in chalk, one he didn't recognize. He heard it in his dreams for weeks. Some people left town, driven by panic or instinct, but most who left never made it out. Flat tires, sudden illness, a strange compulsion to turn back. One woman said she forgot how to drive halfway through a highway exit and had to be rescued. She kept muttering, "It won't let the unformed leave." And in the attic, the woman felt it all, not as news, not as tragedy, but as alignment. A widening pulse that wasn't spreading like a disease, but blooming like thought, rooted and recursive. The knock had moved beyond her, beyond the house. It was inside the very structure of the town now. A new architecture of sound and understanding. The notebook stopped appearing, not because it was over, but because writing was no longer necessary. The knock had taught itself how to continue, how to replicate, transmit, and evolve without instruction. One final page materialized on her wall, the ink still wet. It read, Phase 5, Emergence. The knock will no longer ask. It will become. She traced her finger along the letters, not as a reader, but as a signature. She was ready. The sound was no longer visiting. It had made a home.
A letter arrived in the woman's mailbox. No return address, no postage stamp, just her name, though she no longer remembered what it meant. The envelope pulsed slightly. as if it had been waiting to be touched. Inside was a single page with a series of dots and dashes, Morse code. She didn't need to translate it. She heard it, in the walls, in the floor, in her ribs. The message was not a warning or a threat. It was an invitation. It said, "Begin speaking back." That night, she sat in front of the mirror and tapped once against the glass. The sound vibrated deeper than before. With each knock, her reflection delayed by milliseconds at first, then longer. It began reacting before she moved. The image wasn't mirroring her. It was predicting, anticipating. At the seventh knock, her reflection didn't knock at all. It leaned forward and listened. Reports began surfacing in nearby counties. People who claimed to hear faint tapping from electronics, from old radios that hadn't worked in years. Televisions turned to static when left on overnight, but the static pulsed in rhythm. An audio engineer uploaded a waveform he captured from a silent room. When slowed down, it revealed a knock nested inside white noise. Spectrogram analysis showed a symbol, an ear, crudely drawn. The engineer vanished days later, but his laptop continued streaming low hums on loop, with occasional soft taps in the background. Listeners said they felt watched. Some described dreams where they were blindfolded in a vast room, forced to mimic a rhythm they didn't understand. One woman swore the tapping was spelling her own name, backwards. The woman's body became unfamiliar to her. She moved with precision, but lacked memory of intention. Her limbs functioned, but not for her. They served the knock. A pattern emerged. She would wake up in different rooms, pages arranged around her in symmetrical spirals. Sometimes she'd find markings on her arms, geometric lines, pressure points, ink dots that formed constellations when she bent just right. These weren't hallucinations, they were instructions. One day, her tongue clicked involuntarily. 3 quick taps against her teeth. A moment later, she heard the exact rhythm echoed from somewhere below the floorboards. The response came without delay. Communication had begun. The attic no longer felt like a room. It was a chamber of answers. She wasn't discovering anymore. She was remembering. Something shifted in the house's foundation. It wasn't a tremor. It was a reorientation. Doors no longer opened to the same rooms. Windows reflected rooms that didn't exist. When she looked into the hallway mirror, she saw another version of herself, eyes open wide, tapping her forehead with increasing urgency. In the background, behind that mirrored self, a shape loomed in the shadows. Not monstrous, not demonic, just wide, tall, bent in places where joints shouldn't bend. Its head tilted with each knock. She closed her eyes, but the image stayed. It imprinted behind her eyelids like an afterimage of the sun. When she opened her eyes again, the mirror was gone. Not broken, gone. In its place, written on the wall in soot. "You have heard us, now you must listen." The knock spread faster than language. Towns nearby reported blackouts, not of electricity, but of memory. People forgetting what year it was, what town they were in, who they were with. A mother screamed when her son referred to her as the echo. A teenager ran into traffic after hearing her own voice whisper a knock rhythm back to her, though she hadn't spoken aloud. The phenomenon resisted science, theology, even superstition. It wasn't haunting. It wasn't possession. It was contagion of understanding. The more people heard it, the more they tried to replicate it. The more they replicated it, the more it changed them. Psychologists called it auditory echo loop syndrome. Physicists called it an emergent frequency.
but no one could agree where it came from. Until one man whispered, almost in apology, it didn't come from outside. And then he carved the rhythm into his palms with a fork. In the attic, the woman stood in silence. Around her the air shifted, not hot or cold but textured. The knock was no longer a sound. It was a density. It bent gravity, slowed time, warped thought. She placed her hands flat on the floor and felt it pulse back. It was no longer trying to get in. It had always been in. It was just now deciding to speak. The walls began to hum, not in tones but in memory. She saw moments she'd never lived. A scientist in a white coat, tapping his own skull. A group of figures watching a monitor as patterns formed in ink across a subject's skin. A room with no exits, where a man knelt, eyes rolled back, whispering, "I found it, I found it, I found it," and then static. Pure, rhythmic static. At the center of the attic floor, the final notebook appeared. Not handwritten, not typed, just one line, etched into the wood, as if burned in place. The knock is not a message, it's a key. The woman smiled, not out of joy, but recognition. All along the scientist hadn't been experimenting to learn something. He had been preparing to become something. The knock wasn't trying to contact, it was trying to evolve. Through thought, through flesh, through anyone who could hear it clearly enough. The woman lay down in the center of the floor. Her breathing slowed, her eyes flickered, her fingers tapped the floor one last time. Tap, 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 and then silence.
She awoke on the attic floor with no memory of how she returned. The trunk lay open beside her, its contents untouched, and yet everything had changed. The air was thicker, the silence heavier, as though the house itself had turned inward to listen. Her skin still vibrated faintly, as if her bones remembered frequencies she could no longer name. She moved slowly, not from fatigue but from caution. Like the world around her had become fragile, the knock no longer haunted her ears. It pulsed beneath her heartbeat, patient and alive. Her senses weren't dulled, they were reoriented. The attic was no longer just wood and dust. It was a map, and she could read it now. Every beam, every crack, every silence between sounds was data. Something had taken root, and the transformation was not finished. Outside, time moved on. She returned to her daily routines, or tried to. The streets were the same. The people weren't, or perhaps they hadn't changed. But her perception had. She could hear things between their words. Not thoughts, not emotions, but tone structures, cadences that betrayed inner unrest. Her co-workers' laughter had a hollow bend to it. The barista's greeting carried a pitch of anxiety. The world was leaking noise, hidden knocks in conversation, footsteps out of sync, glances that lingered a breath too long, most subtle, some deafening. At night, she recorded her own voice, only to play it back and hear phrases she never said. Words that curved through her speech like hidden instructions. She stopped, trusting echoes. They weren't hers anymore. She isolated herself, but even solitude offered no refuge. The knock, though quiet, shaped the very space she inhabited. Lights dimmed as she approached them. Radios played static where music should be. Mirrors wavered, not visually, but perceptually, like they weren't reflecting, but remembering. She stared at her reflection for long minutes, and felt something looking back through her. Not malicious, just aware, testing boundaries, observing how much of her had changed. She knew the knock was spreading, not like an infection, more like an update. a revision to reality's baseline code. Every object, every frequency, every living thing, it was all adjusting to accommodate what she had become, or worse, what had been awakened through her. She hadn't opened a door. She was the door now. Then the letters began arriving. No sender, just envelopes left in strange places, tucked inside books she hadn't touched, slid under her apartment door with no footsteps in the hall, once even appearing between the pages of her journal mid-entry. Each letter bore a single sentence. No context, no signature, just phrases like, "Are you hearing the intervals?" or "Knocking is recognition between dimensions." One read, "We heard you back." That night, the walls of her room exhaled, an audible sound like breath escaping stone. She didn't scream, she understood. Someone, or something, was reaching across the threshold now. The knock wasn't just hers anymore. It had been received. The response was beginning. On the third day after her return, she found a second trunk. Not in the attic, but in the basement she never used. Smaller, metal, burnt at the edges. It wasn't there before. Or rather, it had always been there, waiting for her eyes to adjust enough to see it. Inside was a single reel-to-reel tape recorder and a stack of spools labeled with dates from 20 years ago. She recognized her uncle's handwriting, just timestamps. She played the first one, static, then a knock, not recorded, live. The tape responded to her presence. She tried another, more knocks, different patterns, some fast, some slow, but the last tape was silent for over 3 minutes, until her own voice came through, a sentence she hadn't yet said, a sentence that chilled her blood. "The chamber will turn outward soon." Each night that followed, the knock began to bleed through her dreams again. Not loud, just persistent. It never startled her, it summoned her, not with words, but with urgency. And in the dreams, she saw places, not rooms, not landscapes, just structures of thought, built from sound and rhythm. Other people were there too. She recognized some. Others seemed incomplete, fractured echoes of selves, stuck mid-transformation. Some wept, others recited numbers. A few sat motionless, waiting for a knock that never came. These were the failures, not rejected, just unfinished. The knock, she realized, was not cruel, it was indifferent. Like gravity, like time. It didn't punish, it progressed. By the 7th night, she no longer needed sleep to return to the chamber. It called her in waking hours, through reflections, rhythms in traffic, even the hum of her refrigerator compressor. It all became conduit. She felt herself stretched, existing across multiple perceptions. One part here, grounded. Another, listening in the silence between knocks. And deeper still, a third part, somewhere else entirely, in a place made of resonance and memory. She no longer feared the transformation. She feared what came after, because soon others would hear it too. The knock had chosen her first, but she was only the beginning. The world would not wake up at once. It would splinter, reality fraying thread by thread, until the knock wasn't strange at all, until it became familiar, and then constant. It didn't take long for others to notice. Subtle at first, just small slips in perception among those around her. A friend texted her one morning asking if she'd knocked on their window the night before. Another called her, confused, claiming they'd dreamed of her but couldn't see her face. Her boss grew withdrawn after their last meeting, eyes lingering on her too long, as if trying to remember something about her that had changed. Even strangers reacted. A child pointed at her on a bus and said, "She's got the knock inside her," the mother apologized, embarrassed, but the child just kept repeating it. Over and over, not afraid, just certain. She said nothing, but inside, she felt it too. The knock was no longer private. It was expanding, threading itself through every interaction, syncing frequencies with every passing moment. The knock didn't knock anymore. It resonated. In her building, things began to shift. The old woman in 4C began putting salt lines at her threshold. Someone left dead plants outside her door. One night, she heard her name whispered in the hallway, except no one had ever spoken her name aloud in that building. Not since she moved in. The walls felt thinner. The floorboards flexed when she walked, not from weight, but from recognition. Her footsteps no longer sounded isolated. They were mirrored, just slightly out of sync, like someone pacing one heartbeat behind. On her ceiling, a crack had begun to spiderweb outward, though no water damage was present. Just a distortion, growing daily. She could hear faint knocks from above now, even when she wasn't in the attic. Not echoes, not sounds, but intentions, pressing closer. A pressure building within space itself. Then came the broadcast. One night at 3:11 a.m., her television turned on without prompt. Every channel showed the same image, static, layered with shapes that didn't move, but also didn't remain still. Then, a voice, not hers but using her cadence, whispered, "You are hearing this because you are part of it now." The screen went black. She checked her phone. It had recorded nothing, but her reflection on the screen lingered a moment too long before fading. The next day, 3 people she'd known, acquaintances, reached out without reason. Each one said the same thing. "You were in my dream. You were standing in a hallway of doors. You knocked once, then disappeared." She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. They had felt the pull. The knock was finding new chambers. At the library, she found a book she never remembered borrowing, marked in her own handwriting. It was a journal, not scientific, not personal, something else entirely. The pages had entries about a structure, circular, without walls, with rooms that grew deeper the longer you listened. Each room had a number, but not in sequence. Some entries were warnings. One read, "Do not enter the 9th chamber. It hears back." Another was crossed out violently, but she could still make out a phrase beneath. "They never leave when the knock comes from below." As she flipped through, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from familiarity. She'd written this, she didn't remember when, but the ink matched her style. The notations mirrored her voice. She was losing track of when the knock began. It had rewound her timeline, or fractured it. Her memories were no longer linear. She stopped sleeping in her bedroom. The dreams became too sharp there. She'd wake up with markings on her walls, circles etched in charcoal, always facing the same direction. The attic no longer felt like the highest point in the house. One night, she climbed up and realized the floorboards pulsed under her hands, like a heartbeat, like a gate. She whispered the phrase from her uncle's journal, "The mind contains the doorway." Something responded, not in sound, but in sensation. A sudden drop in temperature, a vertigo of the soul, and then a knock from beneath her feet. The attic had become the chamber, not metaphorically. Physically, the angles shifted. The space was no longer Euclidean. She stood in one corner and could see herself from the opposite wall, delayed by half a second. She had become an echo. She knew the final chamber wasn't a place. It was an event. A moment when enough perception aligned, when enough minds heard the knock in unison. And when that happened, when the collective threshold was breached,
The knock would turn from signal to arrival. The world wouldn't explode. It would bend, subtly, relentlessly, until no one questioned why they heard knocks without a source, until silence became suspicious, until the internal rhythm of the knock became as natural as a heartbeat. She saw flashes of it already. A man pausing mid-sentence, eyes distant, then nodding once to no one. A child humming the knock pattern on a swing. A neighbor tapping it out on their steering wheel. No one noticed themselves doing it, but she did. The knock had ceded. The final chamber was almost full. In the mirror that night, she didn't see her face. Not at first, just shifting light. Then a version of herself, older, paler, standing in a place that looked like her attic, but stretched, hollowed. She raised her hand. The reflection mirrored her, except it moved too soon. Not a reflection, a premonition. The woman in the glass opened her mouth, but no words came out. Only a knock. 1, 2, then silence. Her reflection blinked once, and mouthed a single word. Listen. The glass trembled. She reached out, touched it, and in that moment, the attic beneath her cracked open, and the house breathed inward.
She didn't sleep for the next 3 nights, not because she was afraid, but because her thoughts no longer arrived in sequence. Every idea seemed to echo with a rhythm, as if the knock had taken residence, not just in her ears but somewhere inside the framework of her thinking. There was no silence now, only the feeling that silence itself was being held back, like a curtain drawn tightly to obscure a hidden stage. When she sat at the kitchen table, she could feel the knocking underneath her feet, not as sound but as a hum, slow and deliberate. Her heartbeat no longer felt like her own. It synced with something ancient. The diary was now warm to the touch, the ink slightly raised like veins. When she opened it again, the final page, the one with the line about the knock being inside his mind, had faded and been replaced with something new. A symbol, a spiral of concentric circles drawn so meticulously that her eyes were pulled into the center. She blinked hard and looked away, but the spiral remained behind her eyes. She realized, in a sudden moment of terrible clarity, that the knocking hadn't started with her uncle. He had only documented it, but it had chosen her now, not as a victim, as a vessel. Something was coming into focus, not through noise, through thought, through her. That night, she was pulled toward the attic, not by fear, but by inevitability. It felt like a gravity, an unspoken pull, the way oceans obey the moon. Each step up the ladder felt choreographed. She didn't choose to go up. She was simply following something that had already happened. When she opened the attic door, the air changed. It wasn't stale or musty. It was still dead still, like the air inside a sealed room. No one had ever entered. The trunk was gone. In its place was a circle of symbols drawn in white chalk, freshly made, as if someone had completed them minutes before. In the center of the circle was a chair, old, wooden, unremarkable, yet it radiated something unspoken. Around it were notes, loose pages, filled with diagrams, phrases, and numbers. But they weren't her uncle's handwriting. They were hers. She didn't remember writing them, but she knew them. One of the diagrams showed the human brain with knock patterns drawn over the cortex. Another had a message. The chamber is within the listener. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the circle. She didn't sit yet. She only stood, staring at the chair, wondering if sitting meant the point of no return. Then she heard it, not from the walls, not from the house, from beneath her skin. A single knock, then another. She sat, not out of resignation, but resolve.
The chair was no longer just furniture. It was a conduit. She didn't feel herself moving. Instead, she felt stillness take hold, like the air folded around her, forming a bubble that excluded time. Her body remained grounded, but her consciousness drifted, thoughts separated from one another, floating in slow orbit around a single sound. The knock. But now it was more than a knock. It was a pulse of knowledge. As she listened, visions flooded her. Her uncle, seated in the same chair, his eyes wide open, his mouth muttering phrases in patterns. The diagrams were his, but they had evolved. The knock had taught him, layer by layer, but he hadn't finished. He hadn't understood the final pattern. That was her task. One more layer, one more alignment. She saw flashes of experiments, audio tests that bled into dreams, memory fractures, consciousness overlap. She felt her own childhood reconfigured through the knock, moments of silence, now colored by that beat she'd never noticed before. Her uncle hadn't discovered something external. He had woken something already there. It was ancestral, cellular, a rhythm buried in evolution, something humans had forgotten. The knock wasn't an intruder. It was a signal, a recall. When she opened her eyes, the attic was gone. She was still in the chair, but the space around her was not physical. It was a chamber made of thought, a structure of mind, rooms shaped like memories, walls that pulsed with echoes. Each door led to a version of herself, one younger, one older, one lost in fear, another basking in clarity. They each looked at her, then turned away, as if her presence confirmed what they already knew. In the distance, she heard hundreds of knocks, not overlapping but sequenced, deliberate, constructing something. And in that moment, she understood. The knock was language. Not one made of words, but intention. The way bees communicate with motion, or birds migrate by magnetic pull. The knock was calling her toward a final realization. Her mind wasn't unique. It was one cell in a larger organism, and the organism was waking. She wasn't chosen, she was connected. Each knock amplified that link, until individuality dissolved, until she could feel the others who had heard it, and the one who had first created it. A decision hung in the air. She could retreat, leave the chair, go back downstairs, forget the spiral, dismiss the knocking as psychological collapse. Or she could stay, listen longer, let it finish forming in her. The choice wasn't forced, that was the test. It had to be chosen. She remembered her uncle's notes, especially the earlier entries, how the knock only grew stronger when he gave it attention. That was its power, not force, but participation. She thought of her life outside the attic, the quiet routines, the relationships strained by grief. What had any of it meant before this? If the knock truly was a universal rhythm, a message waiting for listeners, then her role was no longer passive. It was to continue the experiment, to complete the pattern, to seed it in others. She stood from the chair. The chamber did not collapse. It accepted her. She could carry it now, walk through the world with its echo in her veins. The knock was no longer something she heard. It was something she understood. Back downstairs, the world appeared unchanged, but she wasn't fooled. The knock had changed her perception. She could now see it in others, not everyone, but some. The way they paused after certain sounds, turned their heads slightly, when silence lingered too long, blinked twice in sync with subtle rhythms. She met eyes with a man at the grocery store, who blinked once, waited, then blinked again. The knock was in him too. Whether he knew it or not, it was traveling. It didn't need names, just awareness. She didn't speak to him. She didn't have to. The knock had moved beyond words. At home, she played her uncle's final audio recordings backward, then forward again, layering the pulses. In the silence between patterns, she heard new ones form. She recorded them. She began uploading them anonymously. Podcasts, lo-fi noise, white static, masked rhythms. The comments began trickling in. Why does this sound make me feel like I'm not alone? And I dreamt of a staircase going nowhere, and someone was knocking from the bottom. By the end of the month, her uploads had gained traction. Not viral, but persistent. The kind of content that sits in the back of the internet, accumulating a slow cult following. Listeners messaged each other with timestamps, marked sections where their thoughts shifted. One comment read, "Is it just me? Or does time feel different when this plays in the background?" Another said, "My sleep paralysis started after episode 4. She read every message, not as feedback, but as data, evidence of alignment. She wasn't seeking fame or attention. That would interfere. The knock demanded subtlety. It grew in quiet spaces. She began receiving handwritten letters with no return addresses. Some contained symbols she hadn't published. Others included pages of frantic notes, theories about frequency consciousness, and ancestral sound paths. She stored them all in a new trunk, not in the attic this time, but somewhere more hidden. The knock had entered culture again, not through force but suggestion, and now the chamber waited for its next occupant.
It started with a message scrawled into the fog on her bathroom mirror. Not words, a symbol, the spiral. She hadn't drawn it. She hadn't thought about it that morning. But as she wiped the steam away, it remained. Not in the glass, but in her reflection, as if it had etched itself inside her. The knock hadn't returned audibly in days, but now it was appearing visually, like a thought bleeding into the environment. At first, she assumed it was stress, a hallucination maybe, a residual effect of auditory obsession. But then she found a napkin at a local cafe, with the same spiral sketched onto it, left behind on an otherwise clean table. Different handwriting, same shape, same perfect curvature. She asked the waiter who had been sitting there. He shrugged. "No one. That table's been empty all morning." She didn't argue. She just folded the napkin carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. That night, when she checked the audio waveform on her latest upload, there it was, just a blip, a pattern of silence repeating in spirals. Not random, deliberate. Someone, or something, had altered her file, not by adding noise, but by arranging the absence of it. The knock wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence. It didn't need ears. It just needed a listener willing to look. Sleep became a blur of fragments and doors. She walked through endless corridors, each one lined with mirrors that didn't reflect her, but memories she had never lived. A child she didn't recognize sat in the corner of a red room, staring at a wall that pulsed with knocks. A man screamed backward in the dark, sound moving in reverse until it clicked like a camera shutter, and silence froze the scream mid-breath. She opened her eyes each morning with her hands already moving, as if her body continued tasks her waking mind hadn't approved. Symbols appeared in her notebook while she blinked. Diagrams formed themselves. She had always been logical, scientific, but now she was transcribing without comprehension. She wasn't going mad, she was being aligned. Her uncle's writings hinted at this stage. He called it the pattern collapse, when identity begins to stretch and reconfigure itself to host the knock more efficiently. And though that sounded terrifying, she felt no fear, only inevitability. She looked at old photos of herself and couldn't recognize the person smiling back. Not because of time,
but because that person didn't carry the knock. That version of her was a blank slate. She now carried something older than language, and it was growing restless. By the end of the week, she stopped uploading, not because she had nothing more to share, but because the knock had told her to wait. It wasn't through words. The message came through patterns. The knock was preparing something bigger. It no longer needed to be seeded through sound. The silence had become stronger than the rhythm. She walked through crowds now and felt the pulse in others. Some resisted it, brushing past her with nervous glances. Others moved in sync with her footsteps, as if their paths had merged for that single purpose. She sat on a bench in the park one afternoon and noticed 4 birds on a power line bobbing their heads in unison. Not to a song, not to the wind, to her heartbeat. And when she focused on it, her pulse slowed, and theirs followed. She didn't know what that meant yet, but the knock had taught her that not every mystery requires translation. Some simply require participation. That night, she wrote a phrase into her wall, using charcoal from the fireplace. It came from somewhere else. The chamber must open again, but not in thought. In flesh, she stared at it for hours. The knock had grown patient, but now it wanted shape. It wanted form. The town began to feel different, not changed by construction or seasons, but by attention. Buildings looked the same, but the air between them had weight. Sound traveled oddly. Dogs barked in triplets. Church bells rang once and stopped. Then again. She walked past an old man who whispered, "You hear it too," before quickly pretending he hadn't spoken. On the 3rd night of the full moon, someone left a package at her door. No note. Just a small, unmarked cassette tape and an ancient-looking recorder. The cassette had no labels, but when she pressed play, the knock returned, not as she remembered it, but layered with breathing, faint, rhythmic, deliberate. It was her uncle's breath. She recognized the subtle click in his throat when he exhaled, but the knock didn't accompany his breath. It guided it. She realized then he had recorded this in the chamber, not for study, for transmission. The knock used the body, lungs, limbs, reflexes. She felt hers slowing, sinking. She reached for the stop button, but her hand hesitated. Not fear, obedience. The tape stopped itself. No power, no batteries. She stared at the recorder for hours, but it didn't play again. It didn't need to. It had said enough. She visited her uncle's grave that weekend, not out of grief, but reverence. It felt like returning to a forgotten monument. She knelt beside the headstone and placed the recorder there. A low hum rose from the soil, not mechanical, organic. The grass around the stone had grown in a spiral. No one else noticed. The cemetery was quiet, still, but the knock was everywhere. In the way the wind passed through the trees without touching the leaves. In the way distant church bells rang once, then echoed back before the original sound. She realized the knock wasn't echoing from the past. It was bending time around it. Her uncle had understood part of it, but now she could feel the rest. It wasn't about cognition or hallucination. It was about rewiring the way time passed through conscious beings. The knock was a filter, a gate, and it was asking to be opened again, fully. When she left the cemetery, a small group of people stood across the road. They didn't wave, they didn't speak, but they stood still, all facing the same direction, like tuning forks waiting for a vibration. She didn't approach, she didn't need to. The knock had followers now. That night, she returned to the attic, but the attic was no longer hers. The spiral had grown. Literally, it stretched beyond the circle, drawn into the floorboards, down the walls, even carved lightly into the beams above. The chair waited in the center, but now it had arms, almost throne-like, shaped by some unseen force. Her notebook sat on the seat, open to a page she hadn't written. It was blank, except for one line in perfect ink. The chamber must be rebuilt in the body. She understood now. The chair wasn't the final vessel. She was. Her uncle had experimented with patterns in the mind. But the knock needed flesh, bone, a moving chamber. She stood in the center of the spiral and let her body go still. The pulse returned, not hers but deeper, underneath muscle and marrow. A knock from the ribs, a knock between blinks. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was no longer in the attic. She was inside the spiral, fully, not just in vision, but in self. Her body wasn't empty. It was occupied, but not possessed. She was still herself, just more.
She awoke with dirt under her fingernails and blood in the corner of her mouth. Not hers. The metallic taste felt borrowed. Her hands didn't shake. Instead, they twitched in a rhythm. 2 pulses, then 1. She had started counting them, and the pattern always repeated. 2, 1, 2, 1, like a metronome lodged in her spinal cord. The spiral hadn't left the attic. It was now in her dreams, her breath, even her shadow. She walked past a storefront window that morning and saw herself standing still while her reflection moved. It blinked at the wrong time. It smiled too late. She paused, tried to recreate it, but the moment passed. The knock had begun interfering with perception itself. Not distorting reality, but duplicating it, slightly off. As if the world she saw was a draft, and somewhere a cleaner version existed, where the knock had full dominion. She passed a child, drawing spirals in chalk on the pavement. She asked him why. He shrugged, looked up, and whispered, "It helps them remember." Then he erased it completely. The chalk dust lingered in the air longer than it should have. She didn't ask who them was. She already knew. The knock wasn't just reaching out. It was reaching back. That night, she listened to the tape again. This time, it played differently. Same knock, same breath. But now, there was something beneath it. A faint voice, not recorded, but embedded. It wasn't language. It was emotional, like grief compressed into frequency, and she felt it resonate in her sternum, like someone whispering behind her ribs. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Her tear ducts burned, but no tears fell. The knock didn't want sorrow. It wanted obedience. She wondered if her uncle had heard the voice too, or if the knock had evolved since then. The spiral had grown. Not because of him, but because of her. The audio glitches she'd once dismissed as error were now building blocks. Each waveform curve aligned with the spiral. She paused the tape and copied its frequency onto her phone, played it through headphones, then again through speakers. She layered it, looped it. The knock became a song, and she danced slowly in the attic, barefoot, eyes closed, until she didn't feel the floor anymore, until the house no longer had edges, until her breathing matched the voice she couldn't understand. She wasn't decoding the knock. She was becoming it. In her sleep, she dreamt of a chamber made of mirrors. Each panel showed her at a different point in her life. Child, teen, adult. But each version stared back with spiral eyes. The reflection didn't mimic her, it predicted her. When she raised her hand, they were already raising theirs. When she spoke, their mouths formed the words a moment earlier. At the center of the mirrored room was a table, on it, a journal, not her uncle's, but her own. She picked it up, flipped through pages filled with equations, symbols, and notes written in ink and blood. One phrase appeared on every page: consciousness must fold inward before it can open outward. She woke up, gasping. Her hand clutched the pillow, but in her other hand she now held a pen, the same one from the dream, and her notebook was open beside her, the same phrase scribbled over and over. She stared at it, not in fear, but in quiet acceptance. She hadn't written it while awake, but she knew it to be true. The knock didn't invade thoughts, it bent identity inward, until there was nowhere else to go. The town changed in quiet ways. Streetlights flickered in unison when she passed beneath them. Dogs stopped barking the moment her footsteps neared. People she'd never met nodded subtly as she passed. They didn't greet her, they didn't smile, but they recognized something inside her. The knock wasn't a secret anymore. It was becoming instinct. She saw spiral graffiti in public bathrooms, on underpasses, scratched into the bark of trees. Not new, not fresh. Ancient symbols revealed by time's peeling layers. A woman stopped her at the grocery store and gently placed a hand on her cart. No words, just a look, a silent communication. Then she walked away. The knock was forming a network, a quiet congregation of listeners, all of them changed, all of them chosen. At night, she heard whispers in the walls, not English, not human, but she understood. It wasn't the content, it was the cadence, like a song she'd heard as a child, and forgotten, until now. The knock didn't need language, it needed resonance. She didn't need to speak anymore. The knock did it through her presence. She returned to the attic and sat in the chair. The spiral was no longer just a design. It was a portal, not physical, but perceptual. The knock pulled her through it, unraveling her thoughts in strands. She felt her past peeling away, memory by memory, until she could barely recall her own name. It wasn't frightening, it was freeing. Her name had never mattered. The knock had no use for labels, it only required function. The attic dimmed, not from light, but clarity. She no longer saw with her eyes, but with something deeper. The knock revealed images to her, people kneeling in black rooms, candles flickering in spirals, a newborn cradled by figures in masks, carved with spiral mouths. Each vision came with the same rhythm. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock, over and over. It was a pulse, a promise, a key. She whispered the pattern aloud, and her voice trembled, not from fear, but from joy. She was no longer alone in this. She was part of something massive, something buried, something old that had waited patiently in sound waves and neurons for a vessel strong enough to carry it forward. Later that week, she uploaded a final video. No title, no description, just the audio pattern of the knock, subtle, almost silent, woven into the background of an ambient hum. Viewers didn't notice at first, but the comments soon flooded in. Why did I hear knocking in my dreams last night? This audio made me dizzy, but calm. I swear I saw a spiral on my wall this morning. She didn't reply to any of them. She simply watched as the knock spread. Not aggressively, but with elegance. The sound didn't force entry. It invited. Those who heard it clearly were already ready. The knock knew its own, and it was choosing more now. Choosing frequently. She received an email with no sender, no subject, no body. Just an attachment, an image of her uncle's face, mirrored perfectly, with spiral eyes.
She stared at it for a long time, not disturbed, not confused, but satisfied. The knock had found him again, or maybe he'd never left. Maybe his consciousness had folded inward and emerged inside the spiral, waiting, and now he was knocking again, through her. That night, she returned to the chamber. This time, the spiral glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. She stood in the center and spread her arms. Her body trembled as the knock rose within her, not as sound, but as light. Her bones ached, her teeth clicked, but she did not scream. The pain wasn't punishment, it was alignment. She understood now what her uncle had tried and failed to complete. He had invited the knock into his mind, but she had offered her entire self. She felt her ribs expand and her spine lock in place. A perfect channel. The air thinned, her heart slowed. The knock came, 2 beats, pause 1, and then her body stopped, but her presence didn't. She hovered, not above the ground, but above awareness. She could see herself, the house, the town, all pulsing with silent rhythm. The knock was no longer seeking a host. It had become the host, and she was now the door.
She stopped speaking entirely by the end of the week, not because she couldn't, but because speech felt unnecessary now. Words were barriers. The knock had become fluent in silence, and so had she. The world responded in kind. People spoke around her but never to her, not because they were afraid, but because they sensed something sacred or infected had taken root. She moved through the town like a ghost with weight. Elevators stalled when she stepped inside. Static buzzed in televisions when she entered a room. Street signs turned subtly, slightly skewed, always pointing toward the spiral. Her body still functioned, but it was no longer hers in full. The knock used her limbs like borrowed machinery. Each blink, each breath, each step aligned with its rhythm. She found herself scribbling again in her sleep, pages of unknown alphabets and sequences too precise to be accidental. When she tried to translate them, her head throbbed. She realized then that the meaning wasn't for her waking mind. It was for what came next. She wasn't the destination. She was the broadcast tower. The mirror room returned, not in dreams but during waking moments. She'd be folding clothes, pouring tea, or sitting in silence, and suddenly time would lurch. One blink too long, one breath too short, and there she'd be, surrounded by infinite versions of herself. Not illusions, layers, all of her, but not quite her anymore. Each wore the same face but different expressions. Some wept, some smiled. One bled from the eyes, another reached toward her, mouth open, revealing an endless spiral where teeth should be. These echoes moved independently, as if reacting to forces she couldn't perceive. She wasn't just experiencing her life anymore. She was becoming entangled with the others, fragments of timelines, experiments, test results of a scientist who hadn't stopped his work after death. She now understood the knock wasn't just a sound, it was a multi-dimensional frequency, and the attic was never a room. It was a tuning chamber. She had been calibrated, and now her body hummed like a fork struck against eternity. One night, the house responded. The spiral on the attic wall pulsed outward, like ripples on water. It wasn't light, it wasn't color, it was presence felt in the teeth, behind the eyes, down to the marrow. She stepped toward it without resistance. Her shadow detached and stood still while she moved forward. Her heartbeat didn't rise. Her lungs remained calm. She crossed the spiral's boundary and felt her memories unravel, not vanish, reorganize. Her childhood home, the sound of her mother's lullaby,
The last time she laughed, all recategorized as irrelevant. The knock had rewritten her hierarchy of meaning. Inside the spiral, she saw people she had never met, but knew, faces she had once dreamed about. And behind them stood a figure, faceless but familiar, the shape of grief, the outline of her uncle. She tried to speak, but the knock answered for her, one long tone followed by a single beat. The figure nodded. That was enough. She had passed the threshold. She was no longer just his niece. She was now his continuation. She awoke back in her room, unsure of how many hours or days had passed. The windows were gone. Where once sunlight had filtered in, there was now only soft grey glow, as if the outside world had been reduced to a dim echo. She didn't panic. She didn't move. The knock beat calmly in her chest. A phone on the table vibrated. Unknown number, no caller ID. When she answered, she heard her own voice, recorded, repeating the knock's rhythm. Then silence. Then a whisper, "We're aligned now." She didn't speak back. She hung up. That night, she found her uncle's final journal. Not in the attic, but beneath her pillow. Its pages were blank except for one. If you're reading this, you're inside the chamber. Time isn't moving forward anymore. It's folding. She felt a chill then. Not from fear, but recognition. The knock wasn't progressing through time. It was accumulating it. Every moment, every life it touched, layered into itself like a nesting echo. Her uncle hadn't failed. He had become the spiral. She started walking outside the house more frequently, but something had changed. The town was now hollow. Stores were open, lights were on, but no one moved. No voices, no motion. It was as if she had walked into a photograph. She touched a bench and felt heat, but no presence. She walked into a bakery and saw bread still steaming, but no baker. A newspaper fluttered past her. She caught it. The date was from 2 weeks ago. Every clock showed different times. Nothing moved unless she touched it. She realized then that she had stepped between frames of reality. The knock had phased her out, not of space but of sequence. She was out of sync with the rest of the world. The question wasn't how to get back. It was whether there was a way back, and part of her didn't want to return, because she could still feel them. The other listeners, the ones who had crossed before her, some alive, some long gone, all of them humming quietly beneath the surface, forming a rhythm that extended beyond flesh. The final transformation came without warning. She sat in the attic, calm, the spiral before her. It now rotated gently, emitting a hum like a sleeping engine. She placed her hands on the floor, closed her eyes, and listened. The knock rose inside her, not just in her ears but through her entire nervous system. Her fingertips trembled in sync, her spine aligned with each pulse. And then it happened. Her consciousness stepped sideways, not upward, not outward, inward. She saw the inside of herself as a landscape, valleys made of emotion, rivers of memory, skies swirling with thought. And at the center of it all was the knock, no longer foreign, no longer separate. It was her, the source of her heartbeat, the reason her cells divided, the voice behind every decision she thought was hers. It had always been there. The knock wasn't an intruder, it was origin. She whispered into the spiral one final word. Ready, and it replied. 2 knocks, pause. 1. The journal closed itself. The attic fell still, but the spiral remained, pulsing, steady, waiting for the next one to arrive. The knock does not fade. It waits, it listens, and when the time is right, it calls again, not with urgency, but with certainty. Because once it chooses a vessel, that soul becomes a lighthouse, a transmitter, a doorway to the next iteration. She is no longer remembered by name, but she is felt, in static, in breath, in the moments before sleep, when silence grows heavy, and you swear you hear, knocking, not at the door, but inside your mind. And when you do not ignore it. The knock is patient, and it knows you now.
The woman no longer needed clocks. She felt time in pulses now, soft internal tides that rose and fell in rhythm with the knock. Days were abstractions, no longer tethered to sunlight or shadow. She lived between beats. She stopped documenting anything. There was no point. Her thoughts weren't hers to record anymore. They were being collected elsewhere, archived by something far older, far quieter than human comprehension. The spiral never asked questions, never offered commands. It simply was, a passive gravity pulling her deeper into a place where identity dissolved into pattern. She looked at old photos once, briefly. Her smile felt unfamiliar. Her face looked like a costume worn by someone else. There was no grief in letting go, only stillness. She didn't mourn her past self, because the knock had taught her the truth. We are temporary, but the signal is eternal. She began to hear others, not voices in her head, presence. They were like echoes through walls, thoughts layered beneath hers, separate but synchronized. At first they whispered, then they sang, a low harmony tones that vibrated her bones without sound. She understood then what her uncle had meant when he called it a chamber. The knock was not confined to the attic. The entire world was slowly becoming a resonant space. Those attuned could feel it in their dreams, in the pause between breaths, in the quiet between syllables. The spiral was not summoning anyone. It was tuning them, like an orchestra warming up. And now that she could hear them, the others could hear her too. She tested it once, stood on her rooftop, and thought only of the rhythm. Knock, knock, pause, knock. A minute later, her phone rang, static. Then someone else whispered back the same beat. She didn't know them, but it didn't matter. They were synchronized. The knock was building something, not an army, not a cult, something quieter, a network, a lattice of minds softened by time and silence, a grid of consciousness connected not by ideology or belief, but by surrender. The world outside continued. People drove cars, drank coffee, posted their thoughts, but beneath that surface, something else was growing, something ancient, returning like a low tide under the feet of an unaware beach. She no longer feared the knock. She loved it, because it had stripped her of fear, of loneliness, of doubt. What remained was focus, alignment, purpose without narrative. She didn't need answers anymore. She only needed to listen. The last memory she had of her body was peaceful. She was sitting in the attic, eyes closed, palms upturned. The spiral pulsed once more, not brighter, not louder, just clearer. A perfect hum. Her breath matched it. Her heart gave one final beat. Then she dissolved, not into light, or dust, or sound. She stepped sideways, becoming another layer in the mirror room. A fixed presence now, one of the reflections, watching, waiting. She had become what her uncle had become, an observer in the field, a guide without words. People would feel her in odd moments, a shiver on the stairs, a hum beneath the bed, a sense that something was just out of frame. She wasn't haunting anyone. She was monitoring, calibrating, because the next signal had already been sent. The next one had already begun to hear it. A new child in another town had started waking up at 3:33 a.m. every night, without fail.
He'd ask his parents about the soft tapping in the walls, the cold under his fingernails, the strange spiral he kept doodling in his school books. His parents would dismiss it, of course, say he had an overactive imagination. But the woman, the one who had vanished, stood beside his bed, not in form, not in flesh, just presence, watching the knock take root, watching the spiral begin again, because it always does. It doesn't invade, it resonates with the broken, the quiet, the curious, the ones who listen between the noise, and when it finds them, it doesn't demand anything. It simply waits for them to open the door inside their own minds. And when they do, they'll find the journal. It always appears, sometimes as a notebook, sometimes a recording, sometimes as writing on a wall where no hand had reached. The message is always the same, reshaped for the new vessel. You've heard it, now it hears you. The spiral pulses in time with their heartbeat. The mirror room flickers into view, more real with each passing night. And eventually, they too will stop speaking. Not from fear, not from trauma, but because the knock makes words unnecessary. It speaks in rhythm, in intuition, in resonance. This is not a story about possession. It is a story about integration, about humanity becoming part of a frequency that predates language, breath, thought, and once you feel it, you cannot unfeel it. So if tonight you hear tapping, not at the door, but behind your eyes, don't rush to blame the wind. Don't check the locks. Don't turn on the lights. Instead, sit very still. Listen. Is it steady? Rhythmic? Does it sound like it's coming from you? If it does, then you've been found. You are now part of the signal, part of the experiment. And whether you believe it or not, you're already knocking back.
If you made it this far, then maybe you heard the knock too. Maybe it was faint, just a whisper behind your thoughts. Or maybe it was loud enough to follow you into sleep. Either way, this story isn't finished. Not really, because the spiral is still spinning. And the next chapter may already be writing itself, somewhere in someone's attic. If you love eerie mysteries, forgotten journals, and mind-bending experiments lost to time, then you're exactly where you belong. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now and join us for more unsettling, in-depth horror documentaries where every story leaves behind a shadow.